1917, the year of revolutions in Russia. In February, the all-powerful Tsar was overthrown as the First World War took a disastrous toll of Russian lives. A socialist, Alexander Kerensky, became prime minister, but chose not to end the war. After months of civil unrest, his arch-rival, Vladimir Lenin, overthrew him in what became known as the October Revolution. A 70-year experiment with communism began, and it would embrace every aspect of Russian life. It was a critical turning point in world history. Russia in 1917 was a vast country, bigger than China, India, and the United States put together. Two men would vie for control of this colossus. Both had grown up in the same hometown of Simbirsk on the Volga River, and they shared similar backgrounds. Alexander Kerensky's father was a schoolteacher in the town. Lenin's father was the inspector of schools for the Simbirsk region. Lenin was born Vladimir Ulyanov. The Ulyanovs were a prosperous middle-class family. The father, Ilya, was a champion of education and had set up several hundred schools in his region. But his popular liberal curriculum soon ran into trouble with Russia's Orthodox Church. The Russian people were deeply religious. The church was immensely powerful and fiercely opposed any challenges to the status quo. Russia had only recently rid itself of serfdom, but it was still a country dominated by agriculture. 80% of the population lived in extreme poverty, forever in debt to the landowners. Industries were expanding rapidly and drew huge numbers of people from the land. But with low wages and long hours, life in the factory was no better. The Tsar ruled his empire just as medieval kings had once ruled Europe, issuing orders from isolation without ever seeing their consequences. Lenin's older brother, Alexander, was a student at St. Petersburg University. In the final year of his studies, he was arrested carrying a bomb hidden in a chemistry textbook. Alexander was hanged for attempting to assassinate the Tsar. His brother's criminal record meant that Lenin's family was ostracized. Alexander's execution was to have a lasting effect on the young Lenin. One person who stood by the family was Alexander Kerensky's father, Fyodor. Courageously, he wrote to recommend Lenin to university to study law. As the brother of a revolutionary martyr, Lenin was immediately drawn into student politics. Soon he was expelled from the university and ordered to confine himself to his grandfather's dacha. It was here that Lenin first read Karl Marx.
His principal motive was hatred. Marx's doctrine of class war, relentless and aiming at the final destruction of the enemy, was congenial to his emotional attitude. He hated not only the Tsar and the lawless and arbitrary rule of the police, but their opposites, the liberals and the bourgeoisie.
He spent 4 years in exile. Finally, the authorities relented and allowed him to sit for the bar. He then moved to St. Petersburg, ostensibly to practice law. But in fact, he was making contact with other revolutionaries. In 1897, arrested for inciting strikes, Lenin was exiled to Siberia. Meanwhile, a new Tsar had come to power, but Nicholas II was no reformer. Emperor of all the Russias, Grand Duke of Lithuania and Finland, Tsar of Poland and Siberia, and much else. It took Lenin 2 months to reach his Siberian exile. Life there was comfortable. Supported by his family, he enjoyed hunting and taking long walks in Siberia's vast forests. Lenin was able to devote much of his time to corresponding with the communist intelligentsia of Europe. He became a prolific writer. It was while in exile that he formulated his concept of the professional revolutionary, people whose career was dedicated to the overthrow of capitalist governments throughout Europe. Sarcastic in manner and prematurely bald, Lenin was nonetheless a charismatic figure, a workaholic, tirelessly turning out revolutionary pamphlets.
The Russian worker will lead the proletariat by direct road of open political struggle to the triumphant communist revolution.
Lenin wasn't writing only about factory workers. To him, agriculture too operated under the same capitalist conditions. The landless poor were being exploited by the rich peasants and landowners. All were their class enemies. When the Tsarist authorities woke up to the threat that Lenin still posed, he was forced to leave Russia and was to spend almost half his adult life abroad in Switzerland, Paris, Brussels, and London. He was the guiding force behind what became known as Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks were full-time revolutionaries dedicated to the forcible overthrow of the Tsar. Their newspaper, called Iskra, the Spark, became the underground gospel of Russian socialism.
Revolution is a tough business. You can't make it wearing white gloves and with clean hands. Give us an organization of revolutionaries, and we will overthrow Russia.
The Tsarist authorities played directly into the hands of the Bolsheviks. Their arbitrary brutality towards even the pettiest of crimes created new revolutionaries. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated in his own world, was completely ignorant of what was going on in his own country. The ostentatious wealth of his royal court was in stark contrast with the lives of most Russian people. Surrounded by a conservative Orthodox church and married to an unpopular and interfering woman who could hardly speak Russian, Nicholas was a weak leader. He packed his court with relatives, whose first concern was to protect their privileged lifestyles. Nicholas's naive belief in Russia's imperial destiny led him to try to annex Manchuria and so secure eastern ports and markets. Japanese interests were threatened, and in 1904, war broke out. The Russian forces, far from home and badly equipped, were devastated. It was then that the first cracks in Tsarist rule appeared. Reform was inevitable. Nicholas was forced to create a form of advisory parliament with nationwide representatives. It was called the Duma. One of the Duma's few independent voices was Alexander Kerensky. Like Lenin, Kerensky had gone on to study law, and, like Lenin, had become a passionate socialist. Despite being an elected member of the Tsar's parliament and a committed Democrat, Kerensky continued to travel across the country, meeting revolutionaries and planning the Tsar's overthrow.
Я считаю, наша главная задача. Мы должны избавиться от коррумпированного царского режима. Вот эти трусы и клоуны, они должны быть выметены из нашей страны.
He soon came to see himself as Russia's savior.
Россию к свободе.
Kerensky and Lenin had very different philosophies. Kerensky wanted the poor to become rich by working hard in the new Russia. Lenin wanted the rich to become poor by the redistribution of their wealth. Neither Lenin nor Kerensky had much influence on Russian politics until World War I changed the face of Europe. In the 4 years of war, an incredible 15 million Russians were sent into battle. Russia's imperial army was by far the largest in the world. They went with high hopes and enjoyed success at first by their sheer weight of numbers. But badly armed, underfed, and relying more on prayer than on leadership, they were helpless in the face of German machine guns and artillery. Their losses were incalculable. 5 million or 8 million, no one knew how many died. No one will ever know. A Russian officer summed it up. This is not war, sir, it is slaughter. The Germans use up metal, we use up human life. In the summer of 1916, Tsar Nicholas insisted, against all advice, on taking direct charge of the armed forces. From that point on, he would be personally identified with every military failure. Deserters in their thousands crowded into the Russian cities and swelled the ranks of the anti-war Bolsheviks. One of the few industries which did not grind to a halt during the war was the manufacture of artificial limbs. In the bitter winter of 1917, food had almost run out, and there was no fuel. While Lenin was following all this from abroad, Alexander Kerensky saw these events as his chance for glory. In a heated debate, he used all his theatrical powers to call for someone to do to the Tsar what Brutus had done to Caesar.
In order to avert the approaching catastrophe, we have to destroy the Tsar himself. Look at Russia. We can create a new light that will illuminate our way.
In February 1917, there came a sudden thaw. The skies cleared, and people took to the streets. Demonstrations became riots. The Tsar's elite guard, the Cossacks, refused to shoot at the crowds. On March the 2nd, Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate. 300 years of Tsarism had come to an end. The last absolute monarch in Europe was gone. The provisional government, which was formed after the Tsar abdicated, was an odd mixture of aristocrats and intellectuals. It became a talking shop with few practical policies. Its leaders promised elections with little idea how or when these could be achieved. In this group, there was only one socialist, Alexander Kerensky. He was also on the local Soviet, a workers' committee which was carefully monitoring the new revolutionary government. Kerensky was putting himself in an impossible position. Meanwhile, Lenin was impatient to find a way back into Russia. He turned for help to Russia's enemy, Germany. Britain's War Minister, Winston Churchill, said,
"The Germans turned upon Russia the most grisly of all weapons. They transported Lenin like a plague bacillus into Russia."
Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg on the night of April the 3rd and told cheering crowds what they wanted to hear.
The people need peace. The people need bread and land. And they give you war and hunger, and the land remains with the landowners.
In the Bolshevik headquarters, the ornate Smolny Institute, formerly a school for the daughters of the well-to-do, he demanded an overthrow of the bourgeois democratic state. The meeting went on throughout the night. Lenin called for power to be transferred from the provisional government to the Soviets, whose ranks he had packed with Bolsheviks. In the days that followed, crowds heard his repeated call for peace to the soldiers, land to the peasants, and freedom for the workers. To the disillusioned soldiers and starving workers, his words struck home. Three times between April and July, Bolsheviks would attempt, under the cover of anti-war demonstrations, to take St. Petersburg by force. But each time, at the last moment, Lenin lost his nerve. Kerensky, now the provisional government's war minister, was convinced that Russia could and should win the war. He toured the front lines, making emotional appeals to rally the troops. According to one witness,
crowds gathered for hours to catch a glimpse of him. His path was everywhere, strewn with flowers. Soldiers ran for miles after his motor car, trying to shake his hand.
But the human losses Russia had suffered were more than the country could sustain. Despite all Kerensky's personal magnetism, the June offensive against Austria collapsed. The troops deserted in droves. Kerensky, once the adored leader, became the new focus for the revolutionaries' anger. Well disciplined by Lenin, the Bolsheviks cleverly offered Russia's weary troops an end-to-war policy. A warrant was issued for Lenin's arrest on the charge that he was a German agent. Lenin went into hiding. Disguised as a railway worker, he evaded Kerensky's police and fled St. Petersburg. Alexander Kerensky, despite his military failures, became Russia's prime minister and moved into the Tsar's suite in the Baroque grandeur of the Winter Palace. Since the days when Catherine the Great had first lived here in 1762, the Winter Palace had never been occupied by a commoner, let alone a socialist. Throughout August and September, the provisional government lurched from crisis to crisis. Kerensky, always more fearful of a Tsarist counter-coup than a left-wing revolution, chose to imprison the Tsar and release the Bolshevik leaders. Lenin continued to mastermind the Bolshevik propaganda machine from his exile in Finland. Every day, Russia's tired, hungry people would read his simple message.
The rich have lots of everything. The poor have nothing. Everything will belong to the poor.
In October, Lenin secretly returned to St. Petersburg for a meeting of the Bolshevik Central Committee. He urged them to seize power and told them that there would never be a better time to take over the country because the army had deserted the government. His chief organizer, Leon Trotsky, set about preparing for armed insurrection. Trotsky assembled 40,000 Red Guards from army deserters and industrial workers. The Bolshevik headquarters became a cauldron of activity. For 2 weeks, there was a standoff. Then, early on the morning of the 24th of October, Kerensky ordered government troops to shut down the Bolshevik newspapers. With the oxygen of publicity denied them, Kerensky believed he had delivered the Bolsheviks a fatal blow. But within hours, Bolshevik troops retook the presses. Lenin decided that it was time to strike.
Everything hangs by a hair. We must this very evening arrest the ministers. To delay the uprising is death.
That night, 5,000 Bolshevik troops were mobilized. By dawn, they had taken over most of the strategic buildings in St. Petersburg, all without any real opposition. Lenin now drafted a declaration.
To the citizens of Russia, the provisional government has been deposed. Authority has passed into the hands of the organ of the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldier Deputies. Long live the revolution of workers, soldiers, and peasants.
The Winter Palace was now the only building left in government hands. As confusion reigned outside, the provisional government inside, unaware of the seriousness of their predicament, ate and drank and telephoned their friends on the one remaining line. Kerensky had left the palace earlier in a belated attempt to raise more troops. He would never return. He fled the country in a car loaned by the American embassy and was to spend much of the rest of his life in the United States. At 9 p.m., the naval cruiser Aurora fired a warning shot from across the river. 2 hours later, Bolsheviks began shelling the Winter Palace. Disillusioned, the government troops melted away, and the Bolsheviks were able to enter the Winter Palace. It was so huge that for hours they didn't know whether they were yet in control. Finally, the Bolsheviks reached the Malachite Room, where a handful of cadets and a battalion of women soldiers were all that remained to defend the government. At 2 a.m., the provisional government was found in a small dining room and arrested. With scarcely a shot fired, Lenin had taken control of Russia. In November, Lenin went ahead with the election which the Kerensky government had promised. The Bolsheviks gained only 25% of the vote. Lenin ignored the result, claiming that the election was irrelevant. The coup was complete. The communist coup of October 1917 was an important turning point for the whole world. The new Soviet Union embarked on a cataclysmic experiment. Lenin created a one-party dictatorship and directed the Soviet Union on its future course. Although he ended his days an invalid, Lenin had by then created the society of his dreams, a dictatorship of the proletariat. Even now, the new Russia is struggling to understand the legacy of Lenin's vision.